Once the design is completely outlined, then the next step is to begin the lowering of the areas of the design that you want to use to enhance the appearance of depth. So the appearance of depth in a carving like this in shallow relief comes from a careful shading of depth, the 1 inch to 3/4 inch fishtail gouges of various types. From the smaller, older antique gouges, this is about a number 6. It's still fairly shallow fishtail. Most of the gouge is gone, but this is Sheffield English steel, and these gouges are worth their weight in gold because they just stay sharp forever. This is more of a modern gouge, and the shading that we're going to do comes from just lowering one side of the depth of the carving or another. Now remember that in a carving, that making a cut, there's really only 2 cuts that you can make. You can cut with the grain, or you can cut across the grain. So I tried my cut from one direction. It started to tear and break out a little bit. On a shallow relief carving, when that happens, usually changing the direction of the gouge, going from one direction to another, is all it takes to clean that edge up and to fix a small breakout. So the wood will tell you when you're going either across the grain or with the grain, and it will reward you with a cut that is very smooth and leather-like if your tools are good and sharp. So you end up with a very smooth cut, and the goal here is to not create a lot of depth and to gently shade the appearance of the lowering of the edges in the carving. Once that area has been lowered, then I like to go back and clean up the edge with a small V tool around the edge of the detail, and that is pretty much all that I will do in shallow relief carving. Don't go to a lot of depth. I don't like to use a detailed knife to define these edges. The edges of the carving, I don't like to see them defined with a detail knife. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with it. This is just one way to do it, and it's the way that I've learned to do that lets me have a very smoothly finished and attractive wood carving at the end of the process without enormous amounts of cleanup and sanding, and I think those things detract from the appearance of the artwork. The classes that I teach in wood carving cover these principles, and the principles are, I think, timeless. There are precedents in colonial times for the type of carving that I do, and we'll go around the entire design, lower each of the background elements to appear like this, and then the edge of the circle of the compass rose will also be lowered very smoothly, and then the detail for the shading of each of the points of the star will be the last thing that we do. The compass rose is completely outlined, and the background has been very gently lowered around the outside of the circle. Still got a little bit of cleanup to do here and a couple other places. There's this piece of basswood's got some funny grain in it, so there's some areas that won't cut either direction with the grain, so I have to come across the grain. I have to smooth that out a little bit. I'm going to lower the detail area of the background around the medallion in the center of the compass rose, and I'm also going to trace the outline of the medallion and then lower that area so that the medallion will sit in there, and that will be epoxied. I'll use 2-part jeweler's ice, 5-minute epoxy. Jeweler's ice is very clear, is very sticky, and once I lower that, then this will set down into the frame of the compass rose. Okay, the area of the compass rose has been lowered to accommodate the medallion. I still have to lower the area for the medallion, but one of the challenges with shallow relief work and with shading depth is to remember that as you take down areas of the carving, your drafting is going to get lost. And as you go, to maintain the integrity of your drawings and the shallow relief work really does depend upon your drafting and the maintenance of the lines that you're going to use for the remaining detail. You have to be careful not to lose those, especially in areas where there's been a lot of drawing that's been done with a ruler, because if you lose enough of it, there's really no easy way to go back and reproduce it. So as I'm going, I like to go back and take the little areas that I've gone over. These are going to be very light cuts with a parting tool, these lines that I'm drawing right now. I like to go back as I go and maintain the integrity of my drafting. And I have found that if you don't do that, it's always a mistake that you will very much regret later in trying to reproduce the design that you're trying to execute. Okay, I've restored the integrity of my drawing. A couple areas still to clean up around the edges of the lowering here and there. I'm going to lower the medallion, and then we'll come back and we'll do the shading on the star. Areas of background detail that need to be lowered quickly can be accomplished with a deep, this is called a number 11 gouge, and it's a deep U shape. And the deep U shape allows you to remove a lot of wood very quickly. Gouge needs a little bit of sharpening, so I'm going to top off the buck. With a hand crank grinder and a little bit of jeweler's rouge, and I'll cover that in another lesson, cover sharpening, and it brought the sharp right back up. And the fishtail gouge would lower this area just fine, but it would really leave it a little bit too smooth to adequately take the epoxy and hold that jewel in place. I found that the jewels don't stay in place too good if the sides of them don't have a little bit of epoxy on them. So it really doesn't work to just set the jewel right on top of the box. So the little bit of inlay for the jewel provides just enough extra grip that I'm not worried about that ever popping out of there or coming loose. And once I start getting the depth where it appears close to being right, then we'll test the jewel. I'll get the jewel and we'll try it and see if it's got the right depth. Doesn't need much, just a little bit. And I'll go back around with the V again. Clean the edges of my cavity up, and there's always a little area that requires a little bit of trim whenever you set the jewel in place where the drawing didn't get it maybe quite right. So let's try that for size. And that's pretty good. It's pretty close, so I'm going to lower it down just a little bit further. And make the sides of the cavity a little bit straighter with the V-tool. And go back down here and just peel a layer out from around the edge all the way around. Just be really careful anytime you get to a corner. It's really easy to tear detail out in short grain areas across the detail. As long as you don't tear it out, you're okay. If you tear it out, then you got a big problem. The problem with linden, this box is carved, it's being carved out of linden wood. It's commonly called basswood. I don't like that name. I prefer the English name, so I call it linden or lime. The English will also call it lime. And it is an amazing carving wood. But the problem is it doesn't fix very well with glues if you're going to subsequently stain. And what that really means is you have to be careful when you're carving to not break areas out. Because if you use any glue at all with linden, when you go to stain, that area will not take a stain. It'll be white or a light yellow color. So any finish or oils or contamination that get on your carving are going to create a problem at finish time. And even if you're super careful, you can still run into difficulty. Linden's pretty unforgiving in its the way that it takes a finish and the way it takes a stain. So for the ease with which it carves, it's worth using. And that's why everybody carves with it. But there are challenges associated with getting a consistent appearance with stains and paints if you color carvings, which I do most everything. Everything gets stained for sure, and a lot of it will get some paint. So got some cleanup to do to finish fitting, make the area around the edge a little bit bigger. I'm going to use a smaller number 11 to do that, rather than going back in there with the V, because I'm worried that the V is going to break the edge out since my circle is a little bit smaller than I usually will make it for a cabochon of this size. But I also didn't want to lose the detail in my compass rose, which is why I went ahead and made the medallion in the center a little bit smaller than I would have otherwise made it. See how that fits. Okay, the medallion fits without rocking around, and it's lowered about half of its depth down into the wood. And when I put epoxy underneath that, and it squeezes out just a little bit around those edges, and the amount of epoxy to put in there is very, it's not an exact science at all. Not very much of an art to it. If you put too much in, you'll have the same problem with your staining. But the solution I found to that was that this medallion is going to be the last thing that gets put on the box. So the box gets stained and then finished, and then after it's finished, the last thing that happens is the medallion that goes on the top, and a little round medallion with a platinum piece of Celtic knotwork goes in the middle of the Icelandic wayfinding sigil. Those two things will be the very last thing that happens before this carved box becomes what I call a product.